the paper.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. No, don't be hard on yourself about the self-promotion, by the way. I love it. It's good. So just back to machine learning as a whole, if someone wants to get some more information or look for resources where they can learn a little bit more, is there anything out there that you would point them to?
Yeah, there are. It's probably dangerous to open up your Google browser and enter that into the search term. You get lost very quickly. I think most of the listeners will be familiar with, excuse me, with Coursera and other open source university course providers out there, and there's some very, very good machine learning courses out there, particularly made available by some of the United States universities. Again, I would suggest that proceed with caution. Some of them are extremely theoretical, and that's going to be useful for some listeners and not for others. Textbooks is something that I'll probably be less inclined to recommend a single text out there. I know that there are some available that tend to focus more on particular analysis platforms as opposed to machine learning as a concept. So, for example, if there's some R users or SAS users or Python users in the audience, I think they will be able to find textbooks that are available specifically based around implementing machine learning using any of those platforms. But as far as a generic text, I'm sure they are out there. I may not be. In fact, I'm not aware of them. But there's certainly a lot of resources out there. But I would encourage people to probably try a few and find which one resonates best with them. But yeah, Coursera is out there, and again, depending on your analysis platform of choice, there certainly will be one out there for you. And except probably SPSS and these types of tool. Again, I may be wrong, but essentially SAS, Python, R, these types of tools are probably those that I'd recommend people looking at least initially.
So I was going to take a very quick break in the chat with Sam. I hope you enjoyed part 1. In part 2, more on prediction and the intricacies around that, and maybe some problems with how that's viewed and maybe how it should be viewed, which is a really interesting chat from a personal point of view. So I hope you see the value in that as well. So I just want to say a big thanks to a third sponsor of the podcast today, and that is Fatigue Science. So Fatigue Science offer a sleep tracker called the ReadyBand, and they were put in touch with me from the guys at the Seattle Seahawks who use their bit of tech. So the main benefits around the ReadyBand is its usability in a team setting, so unlike a Fitbit. So as players wear the ReadyBand, they enter the facility and all their data is then fired out via Bluetooth to the kind of main console, which is then able to be downloaded and viewed by the coach, by an S&C coach, sports scientist, whatever that may be, for easy kind of acting on that data instantly. So if you are interested in getting to know a little bit more about Fatigue Science, if you head over to fatiguescience.com or follow them on Twitter at Fatigue Science, there's a bunch more information on the website and on their Twitter feed. So over to part 2 with Sam. Hope you enjoy, and as always, would love your feedback. Just moving on to one of the things that you mentioned during the chat around machine learning was prediction. And that's something that always interests me when you see that term and how it's linked to injury prediction, future performance, training load, all these kind of things that you see regularly. Just want to talk to us a little bit about the dangers of reading about, people or companies that may, again, not bashing anyone out there that is, but puts it out there that they can predict certain things. What are the kind of overarching issues about using that term?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a number. So it depends on how long we've got. But I think I think this concept of prediction, my initial concern with prediction used in a sporting context is that we're actually not considering problems in their true sense. And what I mean by that is most problems that we face, and certainly that I've faced in my career to date in sport, are not prediction-based problems. We don't operate in that term. I mean, when we think of prediction, we're thinking about, particularly for match outcome, we think about gambling. We think about wanting to know who's going to win at a given point of a match or a competition. And so when we talk about injury, for example, I don't think it's a prediction question. I think we talked about earlier around certain machine learning algorithms and certain families of algorithms, such as rule-based approaches or clustering or decision trees, for example. These types of workflows and different ways of addressing problems are actually probably more entwined with an injury than prediction is. And I won't go into detail about that now, but if we come back to prediction, some of the issues around that is we can't operationalize a prediction based on the measures that we collect. So, for example, if we are trying to predict someone and being injured or whether they're going to be injured or not, based on training load measures, we don't actually have those training load measures until the end of a training session or at the start of a training session. So, if we're trying to implement a prediction, that means we are running an algorithm or the computer's running some kind of output for us that's going to dictate or tell us whether someone's going to be injured or the likelihood of someone being injured before or after a training session. Whereas in reality, we actually want that probably real time if we're going to look at it as a prediction problem. We want to have that during a session. And of course, that can be done, but it is more computationally complex. It requires someone being able to act on that. And we know, of course, that most injuries, we don't really have that window of time to look in and actually stop and intervene in a session or a match and stop that injury from occurring. So it's not operational. We can't operationalize it. And again, of course, it's also based on this premise that team sport athletes are injured based on overuse or overload. And I don't think that's the case most of the time. I mean, if we look at the volume that individual, particularly endurance sport athletes, train week to week, day to day, month to month, it's astronomically higher than team sport athletes, particularly in some of these other sports that have very, very busy schedules like football, basketball, for example, where training in season just does not constitute a meaningful proportion of the load. Most of the load comes from matches. I guess the other consideration around prediction that is so problematic is that I don't think it's well understood, certainly by practitioners and certainly by coaches. So, for example, I think most people consider prediction as in a frequentist sense. So, in the sense that when I run an algorithm, whether it's a machine learning approach or not, it's going to predict that I'm going to be injured, yes or no. The reality is it needs to be considered in a Bayesian sense. It's going to provide some kind of probability of injury. And again, how we operationalize someone being predicted as being injured 30% versus 50%, I don't know. It's a classic risk versus reward type problem. There's very little literature on that topic in sports science or in sports coaching, for example. And so how we actually go and operationalize that is not clear to me at all. I'm not sure how I would change my practice based on an output saying a person was 30% likely of being injured versus 50%. And then, of course, we have these other considerations that like the confidence interval. Every prediction will have a confidence interval, and how a small confidence interval will change our interpretation versus a large interval is not particularly clear to me either. There's very little literature on that, and so again, I think it's problematic in that sense. And if we want to continue while I'm on a roll, we're also making a assessment that it's a classic availability heuristic in the sense that we only use information that we currently collect in our predictions. And so it's entirely likely that there's a number of different things that are going to contribute to our injury that we aren't collecting in team sport environments or even in a university environment. And so again, we place a higher emphasis on a certain variable because it's available for us, so we can collect it. And so that's problematic as well. And so, I talk a lot about in conferences and the like that machine learning can help us to overcome bias, but it's not entirely true because it's still prone to bias by the inputs that we put into our algorithms. And so we still select those at this point in time, certainly in an elite sport or team sport. And so there is still bias in the sense that we select those items that are going to be important. If we haven't included a variable in our model, then of course we can't emphasize its importance. And so that's problematic in a sense. But it reminds me of a really good quote from John Keats, which is well over 150 years old now, but around this concept of uncertainty. And I think that's partly why we get attracted to prediction so much, that we aren't particularly comfortable with being uncertain on things, and we don't particularly understand uncertainty as well, or understand confidence intervals. And so when we look at this concept of prediction, I think all those things combined that I've just talked about for the last 5 minutes, combine to make it a really dangerous topic, a really dangerous path to go down for a lot of clubs. And I've seen a lot of people spend a lot of time on it as a concept and probably lead to very limited results.
So again, I've just written down trends of when injuries are going to occur, ? Because like you say, there's people out there who are spending a hell of a lot of time looking at this kind of thing. Are they wasting their time?
I think there's two ways that we will move towards injury prediction, improving two things. Improving our analysis, which we're doing, and we're talking about that now. I think we're doing some really cool analysis in sports science. We've really adopted a lot of what we see in data science. The second is far more important, and that's the quality of data that we put into our and probably the volume as well, quality and volume of data. And it's just not there. I mean, we've talked about session RPE already earlier. If you think that session RPE, if you actually stand back and consider session RPE and think, and I'm not suggesting that people are doing this, but let's say, for example, that you stand back and consider and truly believe that that's going to tell you whether an athlete's going to be injured or not. Yeah, you're wasting your time, in my opinion. And certainly, I think, not just my opinion, there's certainly research out there that would suggest that's the case as well. So we're limited at the moment by the quality of our data. And we know that as sensors become better, we know that as that will produce more data for us. We know that as our understanding of vision and unstructured data, and we were able to understand vision, particularly around pose and technique and athlete movement, improves, and that will help us to understand why an athlete gets injured, certainly. And certainly integrating those two data sources will help us. So there's that side of things as well. As technology improves, that will help us move towards understanding injury. And there's probably a third. I know I said there was two, but the third is is computational ability. We need to be able to do these things live in real time. I mean, that's when athletes become injured, in the middle of training or in the middle of competition. And so until we have computers that are able to process, for example, in Australian rules football, vision and sensor data potentially on multiple sites around the body in real time and provide feedback to a practitioner, we're not going to get anywhere meaningful in that area. So I'm not saying we give up on it. I'm just saying we need to wait for the technology and the computational ability, because at the moment, without that, we are wasting our time.
So what bits of tech are close to where we need to be? Not close, but closer than the rest? Is it like the sensors that you mentioned? How confident are you that will happen? Like, are we looking at 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, or is that gap a lot smaller?
Well, it's really difficult to answer that, because it depends on the commercial implications, I suppose. Because the reality is most of the technology is available now, and we know this area, particularly the really exciting area of nanobionics, is moving that area forward very rapidly in other disciplines like health and medicine, for example. So, I'm not suggesting that the wearable technologies that we know now will disappear. I think they'll become more refined. If we consider a typical wearable sensor, they'll become smaller. They'll have better battery life. They'll be able to be integrated with clothing, which we're seeing already. But really basic issues like laundering will become more solvable. Again, and ultimately that will lead to nanobionics probably becoming more commonplace in sport. Again, and then integrating that with vision and which I mentioned a couple of times now, will be the other really valuable area. I'm sure in not just prediction of injury, but also automation of a number of different processes that we see in elite sport, particularly around the tactical area or the skill based area as well. So I guess it depends on just how quickly companies can leverage that technology and sense the commercial opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by nanobionics?
Well, essentially we're talking about moving beyond smart clothing and actually integrating this into very, very lightweight sensors and things that basically are able to be integrated into the body. I mean, I'm not talking necessarily about under the skin per se, but again, that's probably somewhere this area will go, I would imagine. But in particular, we're just talking about electrical interactions in a biological system. That's essentially what we're talking about when we're referring to nanobionics. So largely at the moment, from what I've read anyway, in particular in these health and medicine areas, it's more based around physiological function than say movement kinematics or movement kinetics, for example. But certainly in the health and medicine area, we're talking about measuring real vital signs, vital functions of the human body, like heart rate and other physiological functions and breathing rates and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Well, I'm just going to bring it to the end, but I thank you for your time. But I've just got one more thing to ask you, or two more things to ask you, and I'm not quite sure whether I actually put it on the correspondence that we had prior to the episode. But have you got two books that have been most influential in your career so far? And I feel like I'm dropping this on you from a great height, but is there any two that come to mind straight away?
Let's come back to that one. I'll give it a little bit of thought. There's there's one I'll think of off the top of my head, and as you may have picked up through the conversation, I'm quite interested as an area in not overcoming our biases as humans in our decision making process, but reducing that bias through machine learning and just moving towards objective manner of thinking. So. Listeners out there will be familiar with a number of authors that have published in that space, and you've probably had people on the show before that have recommended really popular books in that area, by Taleb, Kahneman, these types of guys. I actually really like something by a guy called Don Norman, who was heavily involved in Apple in the early days. I can't recall exactly his initial role at that company, but certainly he's written some really good books on this topic of how we harness technology and again how we use it to overcome or at least reduce our bias in decision making. So I'd certainly encourage people to get a hold of some of his books. He's essentially in computer science. It's his field of research. Mm-hmm.
Sweet. I knew I dropped it on you. I knew I should remember to find that across you. That's absolutely fine. That's cool. That's
the other. It's fine. Probably I haven't given titles. Probably the other person, the other couple of people I would suggest that listeners get a hold of would be both of us. Both of these guys are no longer with us, unfortunately, and we probably miss them in science as a discipline. But anything by Carl Sagan, of course, even though he's generally known for his work in astronomy. Again, his way of thinking is extremely impressive. And again, from a skeptical perspective, I think anything from Christopher Hitchens, again, no longer with us, but has written some fantastic work on, ciphering out some of the poor science or the pseudoscience that we are really inundated with these days, more so than ever. So they're probably two guys I would say also to get a hold of.
There's some great Christopher Hitchens videos out there as well on YouTube. Absolutely priceless.
I would definitely recommend having a look at those. Yeah, they're extremely fantastic.
Absolutely brilliant. But yeah, thank you very much for giving it me time and giving it the first day of your holiday, more importantly. But where can people get more information on your research, you personally, Twitter, ResearchGate, the two best places? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, ResearchGate is certainly the way. I know there's a number of different vehicles out there now, but we certainly in Australia, I think as a university system, we use that quite heavily. And again, I'll generally tweet out anything we're doing anyway. Again, a bit of shameless self-promotion, but that's what that vehicle's for. So absolutely, they're the two best sources.
Perfect. I'll put links on the site so people can get that easily. But yeah, have a good holiday, mate. Really appreciate you giving up your time, and we'll chat soon.
No, thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure, mate. Thanks a lot. Thanks for tuning in to episode 168 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. So just before I let you go, if you are enjoying the content that's been put out over the last couple of years on the Pacey Performance Podcast, please do take the time to subscribe on your chosen podcast player. And if you are one of the many people that listen via the iTunes app, if you scroll to the bottom of the Pacey Performance page on your iPhone, it tells you that you can give a little rating. You don't have to give a review, but a rating would go down an absolute treat, just so other people can more easily discover the podcast and the guests that are showcasing their expertise every week on the podcast. So really appreciate that if you could do it, and any feedback that comes my way, positive or negative, is always massively appreciated. So thank you very much for your support, and I'll speak to you soon.